Hello, I'm Stephanie Flanders, head of Bloomberg Economics, which has been partnering with Aspen Ideas for this great event the last few days. And welcome to what I know will be a fascinating and very action-oriented session, thinking about what a national agenda for financial inclusion would look like, and quite how urgent it is at this moment. We've got three great speakers for this session, which I'm glad to say is sponsored by the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth as part of their Global Inclusive Growth Partnership with the Aspen Institute. University of Michigan professor and former White House economic advisor Adrienne Harris, Mastercard Vice Chairman, former US Trade Representative and Deputy National Security Advisor Mike Froman, and the President and Chief Executive of Grameen America, Andrea, Jung. We had been talking when we spoke about this session a few days ago about a phrase that I was struck by when I read a book by Robert McFarlane called Underland. He talks about unburials, these things that come out of the earth in places where, particularly in the Arctic regions, where global warming is bringing things to the surface that people thought would be buried for many decades and centuries. And it has felt throughout this COVID experience that we have seen so many unburials across the economy and across society, how this pandemic has exacerbated, but also just laid bare things that we knew were beneath the surface, these enormous inequities. And I guess the one that we're focusing on right here, which is so important to all of you, is the gap between the financially included and excluded, which we saw also vividly, particularly poignantly, in even just the difficulties sometimes of getting stimulus money to the people of the broad part of the US population who was not able to get it, was not financially connected. So it's a moment of reckoning, but maybe also a moment to feel newly spurred to action. And I know that's how you all feel. Adrienne, maybe I'll start with you, with your experience in the White House and thinking about this issue now in your current position. Just paint us the landscape. I mean, what's been unburied, and what's the agenda for action, which is perhaps also now clearer to see?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to Mastercard and Aspen for putting this together today. I think the unburied analogy is a good one, because it's not as if these inequities and these issues didn't exist before. They've just been, as you said, newly laid bare for a broader swath of perhaps the policy ecosystem to see. But for those of us that have been working on these issues for a long time, these things have always been there. These issues have always been present. It's just that they've been exacerbated and perhaps slightly more unburied. It does present us a bit of an opportunity to revisit the way we approach financial inclusion in this country. And I would even take it a step further, because we think about financial inclusion as people being connected to the banking system in a very formal and discrete way. But in fact, that's just sort of the threshold issue on a continuum. So once people are included, that is a necessary but not sufficient condition for them on the road to financial health, really having the resilience they need, the savings, the insurance, right, being in a good position with their debt. So financial inclusion is certainly the first step. But there's lots of other work that has to be done. And I think the COVID crisis really has exposed a lot of that and brought it back to the fore so that we can have a discussion about it on the national agenda.
And Mike, just to sort of start to think about what the concrete plan would be from here. I mean, Adrienne's right. It's the threshold, but it also is if it's the first step, it has to be the first thing that happens. We can't really talk about inclusion until we talk about financial inclusion.
Well, I think that's right. And certainly one thing that COVID underscored is just how critical it is for people and small businesses to be connected digitally, whether it's in order to get the assistance from governments or from charitable organizations to be able to send money back and forth to people in their family or friends who needed it. In the case of small business, helping small businesses go from being brick and mortar businesses to going online and being able to manage their relationship with their customers and with their suppliers, and all in a virtual environment. So being connected is absolutely a first step. And to Adrienne's point, we've got tens of millions of Americans who are either unbanked or underbanked. Millions of small businesses, I imagine, Andrea, that have difficulty getting access to the capital that they need to survive and expand, and finding ways of getting to them, whether it's through microfinance institutions like Grameen, or whether it's through mechanisms of helping individuals get access to basic financial services at an affordable rate. There are figures that Black Americans pay 50% more on average than white Americans to get access to basic financial services. It can add up to be $40,000 in fees over the course of their lifetime. And payday lenders, check cashers, expensive remittance providers, these are all ways that people might be included, but that doesn't mean that they're financially secure. And inclusion is really the first step towards greater financial security. We need to be able to address that as well.
And I mean, Andrea, I get you from your perspective at Grameen. I mean, you've clearly seen from the grassroots, how this affects these groups that Mike's talking about.
Absolutely. I think the word unbearing is really quite important. I actually think it's very much of an amplification to Adrienne's point. Those of us that have been working in the field know that 2020 was not the beginning of this problem. It has been long-standing. It's been systemic. The inequality, in Grameen's case, particularly for communities of color, particularly for women. Interestingly, we were born out of a crisis. So in the phrase of let's not let crises go wasted, Grameen America it started in 2008, and we didn't have the health aspect to that crisis, that economic crisis. But certainly, if you were low income and you were a woman of color trying to get into the financial mainstream, it was pretty difficult before 2008, and 2008 and 2009 with the pullback really made it almost impossible. And so the organization was born because there hadn't been a national focus and an institutional inclusion of low-income female entrepreneurs who are really the essence of sort of the Main Street, recovery. And that's doubled down true in 2020, 2021. The pandemic laid bare the issue. It amplified it. It was heartbreaking and inspirational at the same time on the ground. Heartbreaking in the sense that health-wise, our communities were disproportionately affected. Economically, extraordinarily heartbreaking because you saw so many small businesses, micro businesses, to Mike's point, closing really, really challenged in a year ago period. We did weekly and then monthly surveys on the ground, and we had 85+% who were just worried about getting through to September, October, never mind the long winter that we're now experiencing. So it has been really, really troubling to see. We were really focused long before the pandemic on small things, savings, weekly savings. And so for many of our members, when we talk about asset building, just the simple discipline of saving a little bit every single week made a huge difference. And that's how they got through the pandemic. Otherwise, they would have had to close their businesses. So we're seeing it on the ground, and there's nothing more important. I think this reset, to use the phrase that we're all talking about here, I love that phrase from Aspen, is critical, and that it is a national agenda item because it's time is long past.
Well, Mike, as everyone said, this has been around for a long time. And I even, in a former life when you and I worked together at the US Treasury, I remember it being an item on many lists, and we would, people would give speeches in the domestic finance bit of Treasury about financial inclusion. But, if we look back to what was possible then, not just in terms of the attention it was given, but also the tools at your disposal. I mean, what has changed? I mean, the situation is if anything worse, but we've also got new tools, right?
We do, and the environment has changed. Clearly, we have digital tools that didn't exist back. I hate to say it, 25 years ago.
When they hardly had computers in those days.
We barely had the internet back then. So the ability to really connect people digitally to each other, to their businesses, to the economy, I think that has fundamentally changed. The whole area in the U.S. of community development financial institutions has really evolved and grown. And when you supplement that with what's happened over the last half dozen years in the development of Fintech, you've got all sorts of players out there who are able to reach that last mile participants in the economy in ways that didn't exist before. For the CDFIs, I think there's a lot of work to be done to modernize them, to help digitalize them, to make them more capable of dealing with the communities they serve more efficiently. We worked with some. One example is the Community Reinvestment Fund, where even a small investment in a technology platform allowed them to channel literally billions of dollars of additional loans through the CDFI network that wouldn't have been made in the context of PPP. And that's just one CDFI. So the good news is there are a lot more players out there who are active in this area. There's more technology, more tools available. They do need capital. They do need access to the markets to be able to serve their customers. But there's a lot more tools in our toolbox to be able to address the financial inclusion channel than there was before.
Hey, Adrienne,
can I just jump
of course.
To what Mike said? And if we hadn't had a partnership with Mastercard, we would not have been able to get money on the ground out to our members during the pandemic. I mean, we had to pivot in 2 weeks to 100% digital because of the partnership that we've had prior to coming into the pandemic, and then incremental, very quick adaptations we had to make. We've given out hundreds of millions of dollars of loan capital, 62,000 loans for recovery and relief, all onto cards, all digitally, never having to see anybody, being able to do it and get it approved on Zoom. So it was that digitization of the lending process, even at the very micro level, that allowed us to have our members have that consistent access to capital and that consistent engagement with the program and the organization to get their financial training weekly, which we really didn't want to stop. And if you look at a lot of microfinance organizations around the world in some of the developing countries where so much money movement happens through microfinance, if there isn't digital technology, really the money movement came to a stop. And we didn't have to do that because of the investment in the technology and the digitization platforms. And that was critical.
And Adrienne, what are the lessons from some of that? I mean, if we've got some things that actually did work and we were able to tap very quickly, if the incoming administration is now looking to get, I hate to say it, quick wins or kind of clear ways of showing the competence and dynamism of government in achieving these key objectives, what would those be?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what Mike was saying, right? Thinking about how we take traditional institutions that we know serve communities and supplementing them or complementing them with digital tools so that they can better execute their missions. We live in a digital age, and so to think that the financial inclusion discussion should be all about just brick and mortar branches or sending checks to people is really missing the boat. I think the opportunity here for the Biden administration, as we've seen with other governments all over the world, is upgrading the regulatory system, not just to think about the risks that come with a digital financial infrastructure, but also the opportunities, and thinking about how they leverage the opportunities with fintech, with digital technologies to help get money to people faster, to help prevent fraud, to help secure identity. Right. I think we tend to focus on the risk with these things, but there's so much opportunity here to better serve those communities that get left behind and complement the brick and mortar infrastructure that exists with digital technologies. And that way consumers have choice, right? Just the way that those of us who are better off in the economy can choose to go to a bank, or we can choose to use our apps, or we can choose to use a laptop. That should be the case for everybody as they engage with the financial system, is really deciding how they want to engage in a way that makes sense for them as individuals, for their families, for their business. And that's the opportunity here for the administration, is to really think boldly about how to leverage these digital tools to better serve Americans.
Can I jump in there for a second, Stephanie? I totally agree with Adrienne on this. And, first of all, on one hand, a lot of money got out the door in 2020 in the midst of COVID, and that was a very positive step. On the other hand, there are millions of Americans who needed the check, needed the money, I should say, were eligible for the money and never got it because they weren't on the IRS's rolls, or they weren't in one program or another. And those people are still at risk of not getting paid now. And so bringing those people into the system is critical. And to Adrienne's point, we have a real opportunity, and it won't get done in a month or even a year, it'll be several years, to modernize our benefits programs, to move them from paper-based to digital so that you can make sure it's going to the right person, somebody who's alive, somebody who's not committing fraud, that you can make sure it's going for the right purposes, that somebody who's eligible for different benefits can access all of the benefits they're eligible for. We work with a nonprofit in Philadelphia called Benefits Data Trust that uses AI to help people understand if you're eligible for unemployment, you may also be eligible for these 3 other programs, and how to make sure that you can get access to them. So there's a lot of work to be done. We have a 20th century, if not a 19th century, sort of benefits program right now, and to modernize that. The other thing I would say, just in terms of modernization, is we've got the changing nature of work. You've got a lot of people who are part-time workers, they're gig workers, they may be stitching together 2 or 3 engagements, none of which have traditional benefits. Being able to have benefits that are centered around you as the worker, that you are eligible for no matter what type of worker you are, and that are portable and interoperable, that go with you and can be used across different needs. That's where we should be heading as a modern country. And we've got a lot of work to do to get there, but there's a lot of good thinking going on in Congress and elsewhere at some of the state levels about this. And it holds promise for really being able to establish a much better social safety net going forward.
Well, we have a question actually for people to answer on Slido, which goes into sort of what we think might be the key elements of this kind of strategy. I don't know if we can get the poll up for people watching. Yes, here we go. So if you're looking at the Slido page, you'll see, which 2 actions do you believe would make the biggest impact in advancing financial inclusion over the next decade? Gender and minority focused strategies, updating government regulations, strengthen safety net, digital payments infrastructure that Mike was just talking about, or increasing access to savings products and vehicles. So I guess if people want to put put their answers there too, they're allowed to that question. It'll be interesting to see where we end up. I think it will come up pretty quickly.
Can't do all of the above. Huh?
Well, there is a question about, we hear, we are conscious of how some of the basic sort of departments of government have been undermined or certainly underinvested in, not just in the last few years, but for quite a few years. I just wondered if you come up collectively, the 3 of you, with some action points, how confident are you that there is organization on the government side to set off to really start on the road to properly digitalizing benefits, for example, or any of these things? What needs to are there other things that need to happen before we can even press the button on those strategies? Adrienne, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I think certainly the new administration is in the early stages. People are still being confirmed. There's lots of political jobs that still need to be filled. And I think reinvigorating the career staff is an important part of what this administration is going to have to do to get any programs moving and revitalized. But with that, this issue of financial inclusion and financial health is really cross-cutting. So it is going to take a multi-agency approach. And the science is pretty clear around how financial inclusion and financial health relate to physical health and mental health, right? And how, as Mike mentioned, sort of the new way we work, and we think about the Commerce Department potentially, and how that relates again to financial health and what you might see happening at Treasury. So I really do think it's going to take a cross-agency approach here for people to think holistically about ways to improve the financial lives and indeed, the health lives of Americans.
And it's interesting actually to see on this. It's striking actually. The answers to this poll is that by far the winners in terms of answers are gender and minority focused strategies, which is more than 60%, and nearly 60% saying strengthen safety net. So it goes back to the basic point of it's a step on the way to inclusion, but it can't be the only thing. Andrea, one of the questions that we've had also is about specifically the experience of some of your small businesses that work with Grameen. And it's an anonymous question, but it's just saying, could you give examples of businesses that have adapted well to the pandemic? I mean, how did they pull it off, and how can we try and learn from that in terms of helping more small businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. I have tens of thousands of inspirational stories, because the one thing that we have certainly seen over this past year is that these micro and small business owners are resilient. They are hopeful. They're optimistic. They have no choice. They have to get back up on their feet. The good thing is they're not waiting for a job. They're not looking at the unemployment number. They might have a small food truck, or they may have a little restaurant or a flower shop, and they just were waiting for each city to open up to phase 2 so that they could reopen. If they had service businesses, if they had restaurants, they had to convert to doing it online. They had to convert to being able to do delivery. And so we stood up micro site processes to help them understand how to, even if they didn't have their own website. It was fascinating. We had people who were just literally texting all of their customers with their menus and figuring out literally overnight how to get them meals the next day, because the concept of being shut down all of a sudden overnight when you're a tiny business like that and you have 1 or 2 employees is really tough. The majority of our members were not able to or didn't know how to get PPP. We did stand up a process on the second round to help them, but you're talking about a very small percent of women and minority-owned very small businesses who were able to access that funding. So they were very, very dependent on being resilient and figuring out, number one, how to pivot to e-commerce or online or delivery. They had to pivot and be very, very flexible. They had to get a lot of help to get PPP, to get PPE, to get plexiglass, and to be able to get masks to open up for their businesses. And so by the summer, we did see the resumption, because they were able to save to keep their businesses open, that many of them were able to get back on their feet, even though their revenues were slower. So what we're looking at now is a way to give them extra capital. The organization was able to give them recovery and rebuild loans, extra working capital. If they had to destroy their inventory, they had to buy it back. That's what we were trying to help them do over the course of the summer and the fall.
And it's such an interesting juxtaposition, Andrea, that you point out. Right, the small businesses that really struggled to get access were often women-owned, minority-owned. That's also minority women-owned businesses are the fastest growing segment of small businesses. 50%. And before the pandemic, there was so much focus, especially around equity in the venture-backed business. And we forget that long before there was a venture-backed ecosystem, right, there were these things we just called small businesses. And in fact, venture-backed companies are such a small percentage of small businesses in this country. So that part of the conversation is very important and sucks up a lot of the oxygen. But then you have these Main Street small businesses that are growing very fast, but yet don't get the access to the services and benefits that they need.
I just want to make one point back to what Mike brought up about digitization, though. 24% of our Black American female-owned businesses were doing everything 100% virtually and digitized in February of 2020. That number is 81% now. Okay, we went from 24% in February 2020 for female Black-owned businesses to 81%. There's so many negatives about this pandemic, but we all know that one structural change, whether it's using Amazon or buying groceries, I mean, everybody has had to structurally change, I think, permanently. And the ability to adopt to these new platforms and technologies has been rapid. What could have taken kind of the necessity being the mother of adoption, as far as I'm concerned, that's what I'm seeing on the ground for these small businesses, is here to stay. And so I think we can't lose this moment, because in the movement of digitization here in the United States, which has been slower, as we know, than Africa and some other countries, this is the moment. I mean, this is really the time, because I'm seeing that kind of change literally in less than 12 months.
But it is fascinating. Just to quickly go, I'm sure there's others want to jump in, but Going back to your point, the question about the concrete examples, when you hear that figure, you kind of think, okay, but what is it? Partly at this debate is about expanding that, making sure everybody is able to make that step, because that 80% already had the capacity to go digital. They just hadn't, and then they managed to do it, and it's great that they got pushed to do it. But how do what made the difference? Why were those? What about the ones that still haven't been able to? Do they not exist now?
I think you'd be 100%. I mean, I think it's just behavior. I mean, everybody has a smartphone. It may not be the most expensive smartphone, and they don't have to have it, but there is nobody, no business owner that even in the low income tier that doesn't have some access to technology, they can't survive. Being able to use that, having the platforms and the apps and the tools to be able to do the entire lending process online or their business online is the firm too. I mean, it's a lot of it's education, a lot of it really just, giving them that leg up and the catalyst, and the pandemic has been that catalyst.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, we still have pockets, including in some of our major cities, of people who don't have access to broadband, and broadband is still being built out. It would be very useful from the inclusion perspective for that to be done. But on top of that, as Andrea said, I mean, being able to help small businesses go digital, get paid, get access to capital through these digital platforms. We've worked with Shopify and a number of others to really just help small businesses get online and be able to manage their business safely and securely. And to Andrea's point, I don't think the habits, you don't go back the other way once you've done that. I always think of my 91-year-old father who never bought anything online before, and now he's completely hooked on Instacart. And so, that's the future for him and for everybody else.
There is actually there are a few questions about financial literacy and maybe having more materials literacy materials put into Spanish dialects and Braille. But I guess there's also just a broader point of what are is there a more joined up approach to financial literacy that the administration could be taking, or is that something that is just too much led by the state?
So the financial literacy question, I think, is an interesting one. I always say, we chalk up a lot of the inequities we see to a lack of financial literacy or a lack of understanding. That may be true when it comes to very complicated financial products, and there's a lot of fine print, but there's nobody who understands money better, frankly, than poor people. If you're pretty well off, and you've got extra money in your checking account, you're not thinking about the price of milk at one store versus another. You're not thinking about the 3-day lag in ACH from the time you put a check in your account to the time those funds are available to you. You don't think about those things. You don't have to understand them. But if you are disconnected or underserved, you understand very well who's got a better price on milk. Is this cash checker cheap? This check casher cheaper, right, at this corner store or at the Walmart, right? So this literacy thing, I think, is important, certainly when we're talking maybe about mortgages and, small business loans.
Any kind of borrowing, surely.
Yeah, but I do think we sort of get caught up in the literacy debate, and it's a slippery slope, and I don't think this is what the questioner intended, but it's a slippery slope to sort of blaming the victim. And so I think from a policy perspective, we have to be very careful about where do we need literacy and where is it just access, and where is actually policy potentially hampering that access and that financial health.
Mike, do you agree that maybe the financial literacy thing gets the wrong kind of focus, or do you think it's still, because it's certainly in the UK, it feels like it's a great need, but it's not so much around comparing the costs of things, it's interest rates and concepts like that?
Yeah, look, I think financial literacy has a role to play. I think our experience has been it's most valuable when it's delivered in the context of a particular product or a particular, not just put out there as information, but for example, as you put together products that help people get access to their wages earlier, whenever they want them, or help them send remittances less expensively, or be able to avoid payday lending. If you can put those kinds of products together, as we and others are doing, and deliver literacy along with that, how to use those products responsibly, what they're designed for and what they're not designed for, then I think it could play an important role.
We take financial literacy is such a big term, but I mean, very specifically tied to our product, understanding what credit building is all about. What does a credit score mean? What is a prime credit score? It's critical. And so we have many who come to the program with either a poor credit score or no credit score. And we're probably one of the only organizations whereby the credit score is not an input to the program, but it is an output. And the training around what that means is extremely important, because way past Grameen, obviously, credit being a basic human right here in the United States, particularly for women, having an access to credit and understanding and having their own credit is one of the steps in the financial inclusion step in the pathway up for economic mobility.
Well, and also to Mike's point, I mean, this goes back to modernization, right? If you can close the gap in time between when you're educating somebody about finances and financial services and the time they're actually making the decision, that goes a long way to helping them make better decisions. But typically what we do is we educate people in a vacuum, and then at some point later hope that in their busy lives with their multiple jobs and their kids and their aging parents, they will remember the pamphlet or the website that they read and then make a good decision down the line, when really you can leverage technology to educate people in real time, right, as they're making decisions. And you can use technology as well to humanize the decision and give them very personalized and customized advice, as opposed to the generalities that financial education is usually served up with.
So there's a bunch of other things we could talk about, but I think there is one question which I thought was interesting. I don't know if it'd be for Mike or someone else. So how can we incentivize inclusive products when fintech seems to be focused on people with high incomes? Is that a piece of this?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, fintechs are so innovative, particularly in their customer experience. They really know how to get to customers and create useful platforms for them. But oftentimes, as the questioner asked, they're focused on high income, and they're not necessarily creating products that are fit for the financially vulnerable. Some are, by the way, and there are a lot of fintechs in this space who are doing some really great work. What I would love to do is take the DNA from fintechs and the DNA of CDFIs and merge them together, because you've got the CDFIs that are really focused on making sure that underserved communities are served and are served well with products that fit their needs. And fintechs really have the capability of being innovative. And that's where this modernization effort really comes. And in the context of COVID, we were working with both fintechs and CDFIs to bring them together to see if they could refer loans back and forth to each other, or could source small businesses that needed access to PPP and things of that sort. So I think there's work to be done there. And I see fintechs outside the United States, places like Latin America, that are doing amazing work on financial inclusion. I think there are more and more in the United States that are doing so as well.
And I know we'd had discussion in the planning for this session about Senator Chris Coons' proposal for a National Financial Inclusion Commission run by the Treasury. He hasn't sort of fully unveiled that now, but I think there was a sort of supportive audience for that amongst all of you. Do you think that would send a powerful message? Would it be a useful organizing tool for bringing together different things, or should it just be a broader target of greater financial inclusion across many departments? To Adrienne's point.
Well, I think there are lots of cross-agency initiatives that are led by one agency or another, Treasury or the White House or Commerce. So I think it's less important sort of who's leading it, but I think by the very nature of the problem, it will have to be sort of a cross-agency or interagency response.
But do you think a commission would help, or is it actually just a sort of a bit of a window dressing, and that it would be more important just to get on with pushing all these many levers that we've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I think we haven't seen all the details yet, but I think a commission could be very helpful, right? It gives people an organizing framework around which to act, and puts it sort of front and center on the agenda. So I think that kind of thing can be very helpful.
I agree with that. I think coming out of COVID, what we're getting an increased unburying is the issue of just how important it is to have a concerted strategy towards dealing with financial inclusion. So much good work going on out there, but to have a coherent approach by the government that looks at modernizing benefits, making CDFIs, giving CDFIs access, for example, to windows where they can clean up their balance sheets and get access to funding, finding ways of digitalizing payments and being able to use that to really ensure the capability of dealing with future crises. We should use this as a moment, not just to get through this crisis, but to prepare ourselves for the unimagined yet future crisis where we're going to need to reach individuals and small businesses, people in rural America as well as cities, and ensure that we've got all the capabilities to do so.
I agree. I think it would be helpful. And I think that, starting in Treasury, I mean, I think it has to start someplace. I think that makes a lot of sense.
So, Mike, there's a question that puts you on the spot, but since you're not having to do it, you could make a very aggressive question. But what's the one specific action that you would like to see the Biden team take to make sure that more people are included in the COVID recovery? As I said, you can make it really ambitious because you're not going to have to implement it.
The best type, right? Look, I think going digital, putting digital first, ensuring that people can get access to their payments digitally, that the PPP can be distributed digitally, beginning that process of benefits modernization. That would be one set of things. The second set of things, there's been a lot of good work done on supporting the community development financial institutions, minority-owned depository institutions, making sure they have access to windows at the Fed or the Treasury to get access to funding, to sell off assets that they have, so that they can clean up their balance sheets. I think that would be very good. And I'm giving you three rather than just one big one.
They haven't got enough to do. So
yeah, of course. And the third one, I think, which really goes back to the benefits thing, is moving forward with experimentation in issues around portable benefits. Senator Coons, as you said, has a really interesting bill on financial inclusion. Senator Warner has a bill on portable benefits and benefits modernization, including supporting experimentation at the state level, which is where I think a lot of the interesting work will be done. And that would be a good step forward.
Adrienne, is there anything you want to add to the list? Or Andrea?
I would completely agree with everything Mike said. I would add, working with the Fed to continue accelerating their work on real-time payments so that this gap between the time money goes into an account and the time those funds are available to people is shortened to one day. I think will make a big difference in the lives of people.
And someone wanted you, Mike, to repeat the name. And actually, I wrote it down because it sounded interesting to me about the Benefits Data Organization, but it's the Benefits Data Trust. Is that right?
It is. That's right.
Yeah.
I think the only thing I would add is the lens on gender and race. So I think all the things that we just talked about are critical for the priority, but whether it's incentivizing or disincentivizing, if we stare down what it's going to take to make sure that women and communities of color are included disproportionately in order to catch up, we have to.
Well, it's very striking how that's also the thing that people are most focused on in the poll. Okay, so we're going to run out of time in a minute, but I want to put you on the spot slightly because I keep thinking when I hear this conversation about the conversation I had earlier with Mariana Mazzucato, who's written this book about mission-based government and the sort of moonshot approach to getting things done. And obviously, the sort of in order to have a moonshot, you need to be able to say it easily and have a kind of clear single target that symbolizes the success. And sort of getting to net zero, I would say, has become, and climate change has sort of become that for better or worse. But what is it that? How can we capture? What's the equivalent of net zero for this agenda that we could sort of say that would be success? Does anyone have any bright ideas?
I'll offer one: a sustainable, inclusive digital economy that works for everyone, everywhere.
That's not the same as just getting to zero.
sound the same as Man on the Moon?
I just was. I mean, you are like, obviously you're right. It sounds fantastic, but I wonder: is there a concrete? Is there any? I just wonder whether we can think of something that would sort of encapsulate it. It's almost like No One Left Behind or whatever. Anyway, maybe it's one we should think about. The speechwriters should get onto. Any suggestions?
It is challenging to boil it down because, as we've discussed today, right, it's such a multifaceted problem that touches on lots of pieces of the financial infrastructure, businesses, family financials. But I think Mike is right, sort of 100% sort of digital, sustainable inclusion.
That's good. So if we just, focus group this a few more minutes, I'm sure we'll get there. But I think that's already, I think 100% is good. 100% anything sounds good. But I can say there's lots of people have had questions, and initially they were just wanting to say how excited they were to hear you speak and see such a good group. And I gather from the questions they've not been disappointed. So thank you very much to all of you for such a good conversation about an issue which, as Adrienne said at the beginning, should be really the start of a lot of the conversations around inclusion that we've been having over the last couple of days. So Adrienne, Andrea, and Mike, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.